David Suzuki is an original, probably Canada's best-known broadcaster, with a weekly program on radio and television. He's also a professor of genetics at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and has a first-class research record. This year he came to Australia as a guest of the Commission for the Future, and that's where he gave the lecture you're about to hear, at the Commission's offices in Melbourne, before an invited audience. Here's Professor David Suzuki to dispel some illusions.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to begin by saying that it's clear that the most powerful factor that shapes our lives and society today is science. Science, when applied by industry, medicine, and the military. There's nowhere you can go on this planet today without using or encountering the debris of science and technology. Thanks to science and technology in this century, we have become the most numerous and ubiquitous large mammal on the planet. We have doubled our life expectancy in less than 100 years, and a large fraction of us now enjoy a level of material comfort and wealth that would have been the envy of kings in the past. This has been achieved in a stunningly short period of time in terms of our species' history on this planet. But there has been an enormous cost. This is something that I don't think people are really willing to face up to, that technology always is accompanied by costs. There is, of course, the constant threat of nuclear war and an insane spiral in weapons development that continues to go on. And just as an aside, to show what I think is the insanity of our species, scientists estimate that $17 billion a year would be enough to provide food for all of the world's hungry people each year, $17 billion. And the military around the world spends $17 billion every 10 days. It's just a staggering dichotomy to me. There is pollution today that is transnational. It doesn't respect national or state boundaries. We have acid rain that we share with the United States back and forth, and of course it has sterilized tens of thousands of lakes in Scandinavia and Europe. We have toxic chemicals in the Great Lakes contributed by 8 different states in the United States and 2 provinces in Canada. We have pesticides spreading all across the country, PCBs and so on. We have a problem of overpopulation. We have reached 5 billion people, will double again in another 50 years. Species extinction, habitat destruction, deforestation, desertification, energy and resource depletion. These are all enormous costs that have accompanied the miraculous achievements of science and technology in this century. These immense costs, when you look at them, seem insurmountable because of our inability to transcend our political and economic demands and our inability to deal with transnational environmental issues. While trumpeting the limitless potential of science and technology today, we seem unwilling or unable to face the consequences that accompany them. And I believe that we are unable to deal with the costs of science and technology because we continue to cling to illusions as sacred truths and ones that we would never dare to even question. And it is often those illusions that we believe are true that are the cause of the problems that we're trying to solve. And what I'd like to do is discuss some of these illusions. If you look at human beings the way I study fruit flies, I've spent my professional career studying fruit flies, and I know fruit flies very well then. And when you look at human beings that way, you find we're not a very impressive species. I mean, we can't fly by ourselves, fruit flies can. Fruit flies can land upside down and hang on the ceiling. We can't. They have 6 legs, we only have 2. We're not gifted with strength, speed, or sensory acuity. But what we do have is the most complex structure in the known universe, which is a brain, a human brain. And that brain has allowed us to look out and recognize the existence of patterns in nature, that there are repetitious cycles that allow us then to predict their recurrence over and over again with regularity. And the Nobel laureate in France, François Jacob, has said that the human brain has an innate requirement for order. When we look out and recognize cycles in nature, our brain then demands that we put it into order so that it makes sense in some way. And so if you look at human history, you see that all societies, as far as we have records, develop what anthropologists call a worldview. And a worldview is a comprehensive explanation of everything impinging on our lives. And in a worldview, everything is interwoven and explained. People have always had a big fudge factor in that because they haven't known everything. They say gods and goddesses are also involved there. When you don't really know what the cause is, you say, well, the gods are angry or something like that. But in a worldview, everything is interlinked. Nothing is independent. So that if a woman, for example, gives birth to a two-headed child, that's not seen, as we see it today, as some isolated fluke. People regarded that as a punishment for something we did in the past or a portent of something extraordinary to happen in the future. Because in a worldview, everything is interconnected, the past, the present, the future. 4,000 years ago, we see the development of a very powerful new worldview in the Middle East. And that worldview saw human beings as the creation of one God, and that God made us in His image and saw us as being very special, that we lie outside and above nature, and we were commanded by that God in Genesis to go forth and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing that creepeth upon the earth. And I believe that built into the Western modern worldview is that original Judeo-Christian command to go forth and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Indeed, we're not aware of it any longer. It's so deeply embedded in our cultural roots. But we assume that it is not only our right to go out and use nature in whatever way we want, but indeed we must use nature and exploit it as we see fit. That's what God told us to do. And if you look at our definition today of the word progress, I believe in the West, progress is defined by the extent to which we obey that biblical injunction. The extent to which we control and dominate nature is an indication of progress. So if we can predict and control weather, earthquakes, floods, that's progress. If we can genetically engineer organisms or ourselves, that's progress. And as you all are aware, it was in the 17th century that a new way of knowing arose. We have come to call it science. But many scientists are not aware of the fact that science arose as a radically different approach to knowledge and made no pretense at being able to provide a worldview. What scientists said was, gee, the cosmos is very complicated. We can't provide a holistic, comprehensive explanation. We will, in fact, do exactly the opposite. We will focus our attention on a small part of nature and attempt to isolate that fragment and bring that part of nature into the laboratory. And if you can control it in the laboratory and measure everything going into that piece of nature and everything coming out, then you gain an understanding of that bit of nature. So what science does is it looks at nature in fragmented bits and pieces. And scientists made no pretense at being able to understand the whole. It did the exact opposite of providing worldview. But Isaac Newton, who sensed that the universe was some kind of giant machine or clockwork mechanism, got this notion that science was so powerful, we could look at this giant clockwork universe, dissect the cogs and the wheels and the springs in our laboratories, and eventually, if we could reduce nature to its smallest parts and understand enough of those parts, we'd be able to put them all back together again and get a comprehensive explanation of the universe. That reductionist approach has really driven science ever since Newton's time. The faith that, in fact, through science, we would eventually give a holistic picture. Now, physicists today know that that's a lot of baloney. And physicists know that the only absolute in the universe is the speed of light, and that even at the most elementary particles, you can't see the exact behavior of particles. You can only predict it statistically and so on. And the Heisenberg problem of we don't really know what nature is because in order to look at it, we have to interpose ourselves and change it. And so we can never know nature as it really exists. So I think the most important insight that physicists have given us is you can look at an isolated fragment of nature and understand everything about that and assume that it approximates the way it really is in the wild, so to speak. But when you take those two fragments and put them together, they interact in a way that is not predictable from the isolated parts. In other words, if you ask a physicist, what are all of the atomic properties of oxygen? A physicist can tell you that very clearly. What are the atomic properties of hydrogen? They can tell you that. But then if you say, well, what happens if I take two atoms of hydrogen and combine them with one atom of oxygen to make a molecule of water? What will the properties of water? And a physicist would say, well, I can't tell you. Because the properties of atomic hydrogen and oxygen are not useful in telling you how they will interact to behave as a larger entity. There are what Roger Sperry, the Nobel laureate at Caltech, calls emergent properties that come out of the complexity of these smaller elements. So you can't predict these emergent properties. You have to look at the whole in order to see what properties they exhibit. That's a very profound insight, I think. Now, the interesting thing is that physicists know that, but biologists have never accepted that in the 20th century. And the reason they don't, I believe, is because historically there has been a concept called vitalism in biology. And vitalism was this notion that life has some vital force that non-life does not possess. So that there's a vital force in me that doesn't exist in a rock or a piece of dirt. And so biologists spent centuries taking living animals or cells and weighing them and then killing them and then weighing them again to see if they could get the weight of this vital force. And it's a discredited notion, but the minute a biologist says, gee, I think that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, they say you're a vitalist. And so I think that we've locked ourselves into this idea that there is some kind of spiritual essence that life possesses when you say that a living organism has properties that cannot be predicted by its parts. So a biochemist now operates on the assumption that if you look at the molecular biology of a cell, you look at its components, its organelles, and its macromolecules, that we will be able to give a comprehensive explanation of a cell. I simply don't believe that. If you look at geneticists, they assume that if we can get an entire sequence of all of the bases in DNA molecules in the human genetic blueprint, that we will have a comprehensive explanation of what makes a human being a human being. I deny that categorically. I don't think that there's any evidence that that's the case. And neurobiologists assume that they will be able to explain all of the complexity of human thought and behavior by simply mapping the complete neural circuitry of the brain. And I don't believe that for a minute. Nor do I believe, as ecologists seem to think, that we can essentially model the entire ecosystem by putting in predator-prey relationships, and we will comprehend the whole system. I don't believe that for a minute. But biologists essentially are running on the reductionist assumptions that began with the Newtonian revolution. Now, if you look at the history of our species, for 99.9% of our history, we developed new technologies by trial and error. We just looked, we observed, we remembered things that we'd done in the past that worked or didn't work, and gradually through our own inventiveness and this observation and painstaking experience, we developed new technologies. With that way of developing technology, it's very painful and it takes time. Technology developed very slowly throughout human history. I believe that Hiroshima signaled a profound shift. You see, up until Hiroshima, well, maybe a little before that, but symbolically, Hiroshima represents that shift. We developed technology long before we understood the scientific basis for it. People invented glass or pottery or dyes long before we knew what was going on from a scientific standpoint. Hiroshima was a radically different event because the greatest scientists of the day conceived of the atomic bomb. Those very scientists sold the idea to politicians, and then they successfully built it. And ever since Hiroshima, science and the military have been inextricably linked. You can't imagine modern warfare without science, nor can you imagine science today without massive infusions of defense money. And ever since Hiroshima, it has been science that has been the source of the ideas and inventions that have fueled the massive outpouring of new technology. Because science provides you with these very powerful insights and funnels this into technology. We have this outpouring then at a rate beyond anything ever known in human history. And what this has done has been to provide us with the illusion that science is giving us insights that allow us to understand and control nature. The vast majority of scientists will tell you that what they're involved in is a search for truth. That scientists in the search for truth have no special responsibilities beyond any other member of a democratic society. What scientists will tell you is, look, I'm pushing back the frontiers of ignorance, and when I discover something, then what we do is give you that knowledge, and it's up to you and me as a member of that society to decide what to do with it. The scientific community has no special responsibilities. We're just trying to find new information, new knowledge about the world. That is, I think, is a denial of a very important reality, that over half of all scientists work directly for the military, carry out work under government contracts for the military. And the bulk of the remainder of the scientific community don't work in hospitals or in universities. They work for private industry. And most of the scientific information that comes out under those auspices then comes out as classified literature. It is not accessible to the general public. It means the bulk of science is being applied directly for destructive power or profit. And I think you get yourself into a very dangerous situation then when, as a scientist, you claim, I don't have any special responsibility. The public is what decides how science is. How can the public have an input when scientific enterprise is plugged directly into military and free enterprise production? So I think scientists have abrogated a great deal of their responsibility by not speaking out on these kinds of issues. And those scientists working for the military and private industry are our colleagues. They're our peer group. They're often our students. They are a part of the community. And scientists are uniquely bilingual in that we speak the complex jargon of science and the everyday vernacular of our society. So that we are uniquely equipped to translate what's going on in our area to the general public. And I think scientists have too often slid behind this barrier of an excuse, saying, look, we're just searching for knowledge, it's up to you. And I think the public ought to be much more demanding that the scientists acknowledge they have special responsibilities. We haven't done that as a society. Another illusion that we maintain, and this is often promulgated again by scientists, is that science is an activity that is value-free. That by virtue of our ability to describe experiments that can be repeated anywhere else in the world, we are in the business of discovering objective truth. And that kind of illusion is a denial, again, of any knowledge of history. The history of science is that science is first and foremost a human activity, carried out by fallible, prejudiced, biased human beings. And that we as human beings carry out activities that can't help but reflect our cultural and genetic and experiential limitations and biases. We each see the world through the filters of our genes and our cultural background. So if, in fact, as exists now, the bulk of the scientific community are white, upper middle class males, they will, through no evil intent, they will be incapable of doing anything but pursuing science through the perceived priorities of that particular group. I don't think it's an accident that in a world that is beset by poverty, malnutrition, parasitic disease, that we are preoccupied with issues like in vitro fertilization, which to me is just a totally trivial issue, one that in a global scale is absolutely insignificant and ought not to be a priority for medicine and science, that we're preoccupied with cancer. In many countries of the world, cancer, which is predominantly a disease of old age, is not an issue because people don't live long enough to get cancer and die of it. But it is a reflection of our culture and our priorities. And if you look again at the history of science, over and over again, you see the fact that people couldn't escape their own cultural biases. And as a geneticist, I'm struck by the history in my area when early in this century, eminent geneticists in the world, for example, Edward East, who was the president of the Genetic Society of America and professor at Harvard, was saying that, and I quote, "The black is inferior to the white. That is not conjecture or hypothesis. That is a statement of actual fact." I mean, I could go on and simply document the kinds of truths that were being talked about by scientists early in the century in genetics. Science is not a value-free activity. It is a human activity and will reflect the cultural limitations and filters of each individual. We cling to the illusion that through scientific knowledge, we gain the ability to control and manage nature. And I think, to me, words like managing our resources or harvesting carry with them the implication that all of nature is kind of like a field of tomatoes or a field of pigs, that we know enough to be able to control these resources. And again, this is, I think, one of the most damaging illusions that we cling to. Science cannot provide the kind of knowledge that we need to manage nature, because by its very nature, it looks at the environment in bits and pieces. It gives us a fragmented view. As I said, we can't comprehend the whole system. And scientific knowledge will always be incomplete. There's far more that we don't know than what we have learned so far and what we will learn in the future. And I like to use an example of the kind of incompleteness of our knowledge. If you had gone to oceanographers 10 years ago and said, how well can you model the marine ecosystem? They would have probably had very sophisticated computer models built on phytoplankton and zooplankton. These were the base of the whole food chain in the complex ecosystem of the ocean. But about 6 years ago, scientists discovered there was a whole new group of organisms that we didn't know existed. They're called microplankton. And microplankton are 10 to 100 times smaller than zooplankton or phytoplankton. They're so small, they go through the finest plankton nets. You can't see them under a light microscope. You have to use an electron microscope. Now we know that microplankton are at the base of what we think is a food chain, and they are so numerous that they contribute the bulk of the oxygen in the atmosphere. And yet 10 years ago, we didn't even know they existed. Biologists estimate that there are about 30 million animal and plant species in the world. We have only identified 1.7 million of them. So we barely know a little more than 5% of all of the genetic diversity of the planet. How can we possibly talk about managing our resources? And I don't know how it is in Australia, but in Canada, we have been gifted with natural treasures that are the envy of the vast majority of people in the world. And we have acted as if we know what we're doing, and the assumption is a duck, a tree, a fish, a fish. And so our foresters go in, for example, to some of the last great virgin stands of forests in British Columbia, and they're cutting them down because they say, look, it doesn't matter that many of these trees are 1,200 years old, that they took 5,000, 6,000 years to evolve as a mature forest. We will clear cut these entire watersheds, and we'll plant seedlings, and we'll reforest it, and we will sustain the yield. It is a total illusion to think they understand the complexity of such a watershed, and we know that they will never replace what they have cut down. But we have this idea that a tree is a tree, or a bird, another classic example. We have one of the great flyways of migratory waterfowl in North America that goes up the center of North America through Manitoba and Saskatchewan, which is filled with tens of thousands of potholes, which are little ponds of anywhere from half an acre to 10 acres in size. And it sustains a flyway of ducks, geese, and swans of the order of 20 million animals. And they fly from past Mexico all the way up to the high Arctic. And we shoot, of course, well over 10 million of these birds every year. And what we've done is assumed that a duck is a duck, so that if we can maximize input of ducklings back into the system, just keep raising as many as we can and dumping them into the system. If we're going to shoot 10 million, then we have to try to get 20 million into the system, and we'll sustain the yield. But the funny thing happens, that when these ducks come flying up, they all tend to want to land in the same area. And there are thousands of ponds way over, and there are no birds on them. They all want to jam up into a few in a certain area. And we say, what's the matter with these birds? Can't they see there are all these empty ponds over there? And it turns out that the reason the birds fly in and distribute themselves is that a bird is not a bird. Birds that tend to land in certain areas are genetically different from birds that land in other areas. And so they have been selected over tens of thousands of years to fan out and maximize the use of that particular wetlands. But by killing them off and reducing the genetic variability, what we have done, essentially, is prevented them from having access to this broad range of potholes. And we've done the same thing with fish. We've assumed a salmon is a salmon. We harvest of the order of 20 million salmon off British Columbia, and so the idea is to get 40 or 50 million salmon back into the system through hatcheries. Hatcheries in British Columbia have been incredibly successful in terms of sustaining the yield. But what it has done has been to replace the wild populations with hatchery fish, so that most of the fish now come up very limited numbers of river systems. We'd always assumed, you see, that they come back up the rivers because of the smell. And so if you grow up fish in hatcheries and then dump them in different river systems, then obviously they'll come back to those river systems that they smell. Turns out that that's not the case. That each little watershed has its own genetic races. And they home in, yes, by smell, but they home in only after their genes determine that they come to a certain part of that watershed. So what we've done is we've got heavy returns to certain watersheds, but there are literally thousands of rivers and creeks that sustain yields of a few hundred to a few thousand fish that are completely devoid of salmon. We've lost all of that genetic diversity. They say we're managing our resources very well. I wouldn't say we're managing them at all. We're guessing and keeping our fingers crossed. We cling to the illusion that science and technology are vital to maintain steady, continued growth. The notion that through science and technology we can sustain steady economic growth is one of the most pernicious illusions that we cling to. Any politician, business person, or economist will tell you that the aim of any country must be to maintain a steady increase in the GNP each year. We must maintain a growth in consumption and the availability of material goods. And it simply flies in the face of what we know in science, that nothing in the universe continues to grow steadily, incrementally, over a long period of time. That's called exponential growth, and nothing can grow exponentially forever. We think that we have to sustain growth because that's what's happened over the past 20 or 30 years. And we see this enormous increase in material wealth. And that must be what has kept us going and got us here. And we've got to keep doing that to have steady progress. But I, as a biologist, I look at human history in terms of 400 to 600,000 years, which is how long our species has been on the planet. And if you plot on a 400,000 year axis, the distance we could travel or communicate, the speed we could travel or communicate, the amount of air, water, or soil that we use, the amount of pollution we produce, our numbers. For that period, 99.9% of our species' history has been flat. We have lived for the bulk of our existence on this planet in small family groups of hunter-gatherers, deeply embedded in nature and dependent on nature for our survival. If there was lots of food, plants and animals, our numbers grew. When we had drought and famine, our numbers dropped. We were in equilibrium with the environment. And we had simple technology and small numbers. Nature, for the bulk of our history, has been infinitely vast and endlessly self-renewing. Whatever we did was a drop in the bucket. You could walk away from your camp, come back 5 years later, and it would be as if you didn't exist. But we continue to act as if nature is infinite and endlessly self-renewing, and that we can continue to spew out our wastes and harvest our resources, and it'll keep bouncing back. So we still have this kind of attitude inherited from 99.9% of our history that flies in the face of the power that science and technology have given us. We only very recently have begun to see that equilibrium with nature begin to flex upwards in the last century, and it's only in this century that that curve literally flies right straight off the page. And because we only live for a short period of time, we've only experienced the part that is going straight up, and we assume that we have to continue to sustain that growth because that's what's got us to this point here. And of course, as you know, nothing can continue to go straight up like that, and it will come down, and it will come down within the lifetimes of my children, and it will either come down because we deliberately choose to bring it down ourselves, or it will come down because nature will impose it. We will begin to die by famine, by poisoning ourselves, by pestilence, or by war. I mean, that's what we're left with. But that curve will not continue to go up. It will come down. The only question is, how will it come down? We live with an illusion that we can control the impact of science and technology on the environment by doing better, more careful environmental assessments. In Canada, we call that an ERP, an environmental assessment review process. And we say, look, we just have to have better ERPs, and then we will be able to develop new technologies. I don't quarrel with the fact that we have to do environmental assessments, and as carefully and fully as we can. But let me say that it is an illusion to think that that allows us to predict and control the environmental impact of our technology. ERPs are too limited in scale, in scope, and in duration. Now let me give you an example. Right now, there's a very contentious area off the east coast of North America. It's a part of the continental shelf. Because of deep upwellings of warm water from the bottom in the deep part of the ocean, upwellings bring material, detritus, and dump it onto the shelf. And so it's like fertilizing this shelf that lies in the shallow part of the ocean. And it's very, very rich. People have fished in there, come over from Europe for centuries to fish the rich waters of these areas. There's Grand Banks off Newfoundland. There's a place called George's Banks, which lies halfway between Nova Scotia in Canada and Boston, Massachusetts in the United States, and it's fished by Americans and Canadians. Turns out it looks like there's oil and gas under Georges Banks. So Texaco, an American oil company, would like to go in and drill for oil there, and it's being hotly contended by fishermen and environmentalists. So Texaco is asked to be allowed to drill 2 holes off Georges Banks. They say, let us see if those 2 holes pose any danger. And so the government is going ahead to give them permission. And I'm saying, look, you better be damn careful about that, because that will give you primarily a statistical aberration. It will not give you anything that means anything. If you drill 2 holes under an ERP, you can be darn sure if the whole future course of oil exploration depends on those 2 holes, people are going to be unbelievably careful. Those are not going to be typical wildcat holes. Those are going to be models of carefulness. And if there is no accident or no obvious environmental effect of drilling those 2 holes, what we tend to do then is to say, well, there's a 0 probability of environmental damage. We've done 2 drill holes. Usually the holes are carried out over a 2-year period. We assume that's long enough to monitor the changes or effects on the organisms there. We say there's been no detectable damage. There is a 0 probability of danger. Then we simply give carte blanche for the oil companies to go in. We assume then that it doesn't matter whether you scale that up to 1,000 or 10,000 holes. On the basis of those 2, we simply extrapolate and say there is a 0 probability of hazard. And from that point on, the oil company is given permission to go ahead because they have been given a clean bill of health by those 2 holes. You see? It doesn't make any sense to me. Statistically, 2 drill holes mean nothing. And yet we build our future programs on those ERPs. So we have to be very careful of environmental assessments. And I believe what you do is you never stop the environmental assessment. You may give a tentative approval, but each new drill hole, or whatever you're doing, is an addition to your environmental assessment. And so you're constantly accumulating and refining your data so that at any given point, when it gets to a point where you say, no, it's hazardous, you can stop it. And that's the way I think we should go. I believed when I began my career in television that one could do cost-benefit analysis of new technologies, weigh the costs and benefits. If the costs were high and benefits low, we would stop and not use it. If costs were low and benefits high, we would allow it to be used. And I see now that's a stupid idea. I mean, I was wrong all these years because the benefits of technology are immediate and obvious. I love my laptop computer because it does wonderful things for me. The problem is the costs are invariably hidden. And the costs are often only determinable after the technology is in place. Let me give you 2 examples. When DDT was discovered to be a powerful killer of insects, the benefits were obvious. The chemical industry would make a lot of money, and they did, and it was a good way of killing insects. Now, if there had been a cost-benefit analysis done, which there wasn't, any ecologist would have said, gee, this is a really strange way to manage pests. I mean, insects are the most numerous group of organisms on the planet. The vast majority of insects are important elements in the ecosystem, like bees that fertilize all flowering plants and so on. That a tiny fraction of all insects are pests. It doesn't make sense to manage insect pests by killing all insects, any more than it is managing crime in Melbourne by killing every citizen of Melbourne. This is not management. Any geneticist would have said, I can tell you that if you use DDT now, you're going to select for resistant strains, and within a few years, all the survivors will be resistant. You'll have to develop a new chemical, and it will just keep on going. But no one could have predicted, when DDT was first invented, that there was a phenomenon called biomagnification, where you spray DDT at a very low concentration in the environment. It's consumed by microorganisms, which are eaten by bigger organisms and up the food chain, until in the mammary glands of women and in the shell glands of birds, you have concentrations of DDT hundreds of thousands of times beyond what was sprayed in the first place. This is called biomagnification. Biomagnification could not have been anticipated by a cost-benefit analysis because we only discovered biomagnification when DDT had been used and birds began to go extinct. We didn't know there was a phenomenon called biomagnification till we used DDT. Same thing with nuclear power. Again, nuclear bombs, the benefits were obvious, winning the war and all that, but the costs have only become clear, and we still don't know all the costs decades later. We believe that we create technology, and because it is a human artifact, that we remain its masters and it is our servant. And the problem with that assumption is that our technologies are so fast and powerful and so immense that they are now beyond the human capacity to respond. You simply have to look at a technology like airplanes. Wonderful technology. I put my life into airplanes every week, yet they continue to plummet from the skies. Why? Almost always because of human error. Human beings have become the most reliable failure component in our technology today. So when people tell you, and this is most often repeated with respect to the nuclear industry, we have a system that is foolproof. What they're trying to tell you is we have a system free of fools, and the problem is that all of us at one time or other in our lives have been fools. You can't build a foolproof technology because humans will always outfool the most complex technology you have. We believe that we are special because we are rational, and that we can plan our future, our economy, our military defenses, and so on, rationally. This is a very important illusion that we must get rid of, I think. And I simply refer you to a very interesting concept that was developed by Paul MacLean with the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, called the triune brain. Have people talked about the triune brain here in Australia? It's a very interesting concept that if you look at the human brain, if you section a human brain, preferably after the person's dead, and look at it, what you find is that the base of the vertebral column is a bulge that's called a primitive brainstem. And that was the earliest evolutionary development of a brain in the early vertebrates. And it contains all of the basic functions like breathing and heart rate and so on. That's why when you have massive brain damage, if your primitive brainstem is intact, your body will continue to function. It's under control of that. Then over that, you get a growth of another development which MacLean calls the reptilian brain, or the R complex. This was developed when reptiles evolved, and it has all of the complexity for behavior of territoriality, aggression, and so on that is built into this area. And if you stain the human brain for enzymes that are present in the reptilian brain, you find them in the R complex of our brains. Then over that is a greater proliferation of brain tissue, which he calls the neo-mammalian system. And in that you get the early mammals that had parenting behavior, play, socialization, and so on. That's all built into this complex over the R complex. And then over that is a very thin layer of outer shell, which we call the outer bark, or the neocortex. And that's what makes us human. That's what gives us rationality and logical thought and so on. And all of these layers of our evolutionary past are built into the human brain, and they're all interconnected. When I think of having a very extreme fight with my wife is a far more rational, logical creature than I, and invariably wins in any important debate. And what happens is I usually then reach into my reptilian complex and I hit her with a zinger that really hurts. And I win my fight, you see. And then what I do for the next 2 weeks is I use my neocortex and rationalize why I did it. I say, well, what I really meant to do was this, but in fact, I was behaving like a reptile at the time. And I think we have to take into account the fact that the neocortex is very thin. And that when Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan face off in Reykjavik, what they're doing is really being two reptiles squaring off. They've got all of the historical, emotional baggage of their two cultures, and they're facing off. Well, I think you have to think about that in dealing with how we handle these great technologies that we have today. I believed when I began my career in television that it was through access to more information that our public would be better equipped to make wise decisions. I thought that by giving the public good science and technology programming, I was providing information for them to make better decisions. And what I find now is that this is completely false. Our problem is that we are overloaded with information. By any criterion you want to use, we have access to more information than ever in human history. The problem we have is not needing more information, but, as we say in science, distinguishing meaningful signal from background noise. In other words, how do you tell what's worth remembering from the garbage that floods the system? And what I find today is that the public, the average viewer or consumer of print material, accepts as truth whatever he or she wants and justifies it by saying, I read it or I saw it. And that's enough then to be a validation of the reality of that. So oftentimes when I walk down the street in Canada, because our program is very popular, people recognize who I am and they'll come running up and saying, Suzuki, you had a great show last week on vaginal cancer or something. And I'll say, we've never done a show on that. And they'll say, oh, gee, maybe it was on Quincy or Charlie's Angels. Literally, this happens all the time. I get credit for all kinds of stuff. And the reason, of course, is that the average Canadian watches 7 to 8 hours of television a day. In a city like Toronto, we have access to 30 different channels of television 24 hours a day. People watch television in huge blocks of time, but not intently, where we tune in and out. And by the time you go to bed at night, your brain is mush. It's full of disconnected things that happen to have struck a responsive chord, and you remember them, and anything scientific, technological, or medical, you stick in the Suzuki file and you give them credit for it. Literally. And it's the same thing with print. We are assaulted by print information, and people will simply say, I read it, as justification for the truth. I love the story. I was giving a lecture, and a young boy came up to me and said, what do you think of spontaneous human combustion? And said, you've all heard of this, have you? I'd never heard of spontaneous human combustion. He said, well, you know, we're made of stuff that burns. Hair, fingernails, fat, sugar. There's all kinds of things in our body burn. And with 5 billion people on the planet, at any given moment, a tiny fraction of us achieve a physiological state such that we spontaneously burst into flame and burn up. And sure enough, a few weeks later, I was running through the airport in Toronto, and I looked in the bookstore, and there was a book called Spontaneous Human Combustion. And when you look through it, there are even pictures. There's a pile of ashes. It's Mrs. Smith in Melbourne, Australia. I swear. And the interesting thing is when you read it, you find spontaneous human combustion, or SHC as we in the business call it, spontaneous human combustion only happens when no one else is in the room. You open the door and find your wife spontaneously burned up, sure. But because there's a book, everybody is now ready to cite SHC as a phenomenon, or UFOs, or chariots of gods, or plant communication, or what have you. I read it. That's enough to justify its truth. So that's another illusion, then, that we are better informed through the media. It's simply not achievable, and people are telling me that in Australia you're trying to get more access to the airwaves and you want more channels and all that. As educators, I certainly don't think that's what we want to be doing. Canadian children watch 4 to 5 hours of television a day, and I just heard in Hobart that American children watch as much as their parents, 7 to 8 hours a day, which means they're watching it before they go to school, and the minute they come home from school, they're watching it until bedtime. The final illusion that I'd like to mention is that we live with the illusion that because we have a democracy, we elect officials to represent us, and they make decisions based on considered judgments and lead us into the future in some kind of rational way. It is true, I believe, that we get what we deserve, and I believe in democracy, and I have nothing but admiration for politicians. And I think the extent to which we are pleased with what they do, we as a public, voting public, should take credit for that. And the extent to which they let us down, we have to take the blame for that. They reflect the priorities that we have. The problem that we face, however, is that each of us sees the world through the very special lenses of our background and professional disciplines. Now, I've learned since I arrived in Australia that your system is very different from Canada. In Canada, we did a study a few years ago and found that 90% of our elected representatives at the federal level, and I'm sure it's not much different at the provincial or municipal level, come from two professions. They come from business or they come from law. Now, I hear that's very different here, and I think that's very encouraging. You have a much greater representation of teachers who are virtually absent in our legislatures, and you have a very low representation of lawyers. I find that astounding, but that's very encouraging. I don't have anything against lawyers and business people, although I have 4 daughters, and I've told each of them none of them better marry one. They can play around with them all they want, just don't get serious. But what I feel is wrong in Canada is that because of the specialized vision of each profession, by having representation from 2 areas like this, so disproportionately, it skews our government's sense of priorities. It's not an accident that Canadian politicians are overwhelmed and obsessed by issues jurisdictional and economic, because business and law are the primary focus of their members. And we did a study of 50 MPs in Ottawa a few years ago and found that it is business people and lawyers who score absolutely rock bottom in their comprehension of very simple terms in science and technology. So in Canada, they make up over 90% of our representatives, and they are the ones who are completely scientifically illiterate. And yet they are making decisions about what? The future of medical care in Canada, whether we go into outer space, whether we stick with the CANDU fission reactor or go with fusion, what to do with our forests, our fisheries, our pollution, toxic pollutants in groundwater, PCBs. All of these require some knowledge of science and technology, but they are scientifically illiterate. So we have to be very careful about this idea that we, through a democracy, in fact, chart our way through into the future. Until we as a society are scientifically literate, we will be, I believe, out of control of our own destiny. Let me just conclude by saying that what got us as a species to where we are now in 1987 was our ability to use our brains to project the consequences of our actions into the future. And that allowed us to take deliberate steps now to avoid danger. That ability to choose a future gave us options. And I find it ironic that today, with all of the amplified brain power of computers, global telecommunications networks, scientists and engineers, we no longer seem to be able to do what got us here in the first place. In large part, we are unable to act because we cling to these illusions that prevent us from dealing with the problems in a profound way. And so I hope we'll grapple with some of these illusions. Thank you.